versus, say, a rural area like Ferguson's estate in San Salvador. And I say that considering the work of Bethell, for example, in Centering Women, where he talks about the urban environment of Bridgetown, where you have a greater opportunity for leveraging your work skills and your talents through working in a task system or hiring yourself out or possibly taking in work as seamstress. And it also speaks, I believe, of the complexity of enslavement in the urban environment, particularly where you have diversity in skills and opportunities which you might not have in a rural environment, and also with the complexity of the demographic profile of an urban environment where you have black women, brown women, white women. You have black women like Betty Watkins owning slaves. You have white women obviously owning slaves. And you have more contact with different people. And of course in Nassau, being the colonial capital with various courts, vice admiralty and others, the presence of the law and government would make their relationship and their experiences different than in a rural environment. So that's my first concern, the urban versus rural dynamic. My second one is a question about the enslaved women's engagement in actual revolt. You spoke to sort of day-to-day resistance, escaping and running away, poisoning, maligning, for example. But I'm thinking about, actual revolts. And in the case of Farquharson's plantation, you have Matilda, who comes out of the kitchen and kind of lays hold of Alec and prevents him from basically, killing the son of Farquharson. So I'm just wondering, we have that sort of anecdotal example there, but certainly we want to probe, the revolt in Exuma led by Pompey, and the other sort of significant revolts that we know occur in the Bahamas. And where do women play a role? We know this because when we look at, again, Bethell's work where he talks about the natural rebels. I mean, he speaks about Nanny Greer and the Maroon community in Jamaica. We think that possibly there's more there, too, about women and their role. See, I think there's a sort of, again, Anglo-Saxon history that presents the woman as either a Jezebel or a sexless creature, but doesn't give her her right place as a natural rebel. So I want you to speak to that, too.
First, I'd like to know that research, we do know that in the Bahamas, prior to the arrival of the loyalists, there were black slaves in the Bahamas, but they had much more liberties, and they were actually able to move about and do those things because there was no systematic system set up here. Whereas when the loyalists came over, they brought the plantation mines and plantation economies to the Bahamas, which is when we had more slave legislation put into place to control this group of people. So that's essential to mention. Yes, there is a distinct difference between our urban slaves as opposed to our rural slaves. And this is within the entire region and the entire system of slavery. Because urban slaves actually had a little more freedom. They had more opportunities to engage in economic activities. And many of them had great opportunities to actually learn how to read and write because they actually were responsible for their master's businesses when they went out. And the same thing again here in New Providence would have happened in terms of that responsibility. So yes, there is a distinct difference, and that speaks to the fact that slavery in itself, there's really no one definition or no one research that can describe the entire process of what it means to be a slave. Because yes, we could just focus on urban slavery, or we could just focus on rural slavery. The purpose of this really was to just to sort of give an overview. But again, you are correct. There was a difference with urban slaves. They had much more freedom, much more access to making learning. This was not just in the Bahamas, but within the region, Caribbean Basin, as well as North America. With reference to your next point in terms of revolt, again, I think you answered the question yourself when you said the Anglo-Saxon male. What we know about women, everything we know about these women from Africa, was from a male's perspective, beginning with the Muslims. They were the ones who defined the role of women. And within Muslim societies, women were mostly passive and unable to participate in governments. Again, some parts of Africa, they actually weren't able to change that. However, they were the ones that were responsible for writing history. on the slave ships, what we use to analyze data again comes from the Anglo-Saxon male. Women are just assistant to men. I did mention that there was a greater propensity of revolts on ships that were carrying women. I also mentioned the fact that unlike conventional women, European women, and even within Waters West, we actually had an all-female brigade that lasted well into the 19th century. Their training was much more rigorous than that of men. They thought nothing to decapitate the heads of men. They were brave enough to actually go and try to free slaves that were captured by traders, and many Europeans actually noted this in their writings. The records of slave traders from Anglo-Saxon perspective. So what we can do is what I try to do here today, take that data and to redefine it. We cannot change the words on the pages that have been written, but as researchers, what we can do is ask new questions and also use what that we have in terms of the historical contextual experience and try to create some type of
influential females from the African society being able to make political decisions showing their dominance. So these slaves from Trinidad, Jamaica, all the Caribbean islands came from that same continent. So how would you know that these attributes wouldn't be reflected from female slaves from other Caribbean countries?
Well, who we are as a people is part of our collective identity. The collective identity of female slaves, black female slaves, is inherited within the African diaspora. That is a constant. We are aware of that. Now, in terms of moving forward from there, in Africa, depending on the region that you came from, because within Africa, slave traders themselves knew that women and men from certain regions would have been better slaves, better workers. They were less troublesome. They knew that. So that in itself tells us that there were certain traits and characteristics within these people. Certain traits and characteristics were brought across into the Western world. Certain traits and characteristics infused with the institution of slavery, and within the institution of slavery, we know that the Anglo-Saxon was the dominant voice. These were persons who were subjected to this in terms of legislation, making it legal to own slaves, making it legal for slaves to actually follow the tasks that you were given to them. But again, I spoke about two lives slaves had, private and public. In their public life is where they actually would have had that European-centric Anglo-Saxon dominance. In their private lives, they tried to maintain their Afrocentricity. And from the Afrocentricity, we have African traditions that we see today. So the modern woman that we see today is an infusion of a past, women from African diaspora, and those traits being passed down. It is also infused with European colonizers. It's also infused by the environment in which we were in, because the environment of Jamaica or Cuba is distinctly different from the environment of the Bahamas. The environment in which the slaves operated within and women operated was distinctly different. Because, for example, in our history, we speak a lot about the gardens that women had. In slave societies such as Jamaica, it was very rare because slaves worked from sunrise to sunset. They didn't have time to maintain these gardens. So that construct there would have been unique to the Bahamas. It would have been unique more to our own islands as opposed to those urban slaves. So again, it is quite possible to generate some distinction between female slaves in the Bahamas as opposed to female slaves within Trinidad and Jamaica. And again, from that, we are able to actually form a collective identity of what it meant to be a black behaving female slave, what it means to be a black behaving woman today. Because again, those traits and characteristics from Africa, from Europe, from our environment, infused who we are today.
My grandmother said that Methuselah's one place had a junk canoe. Is there any documentation I can use to prove that?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear what.
I said my granny said that the Methuselahs were only all-female Bahamian junk canoe group won the place at the junk canoe. Is there any documentation available I could use to prove or disprove that?
Well, with reference to that, the Bahamas Historical Society is a great place to begin. I'm not dispelling it. It's just that I that was not part of my focus there. But again, that is from a feminist perspective, something else that can be explored within the context. Because we do know that junkanoo is a tradition, and forms of junkanoo is something that was transported from Africa. And it's quite possible that that may be true, but again, that was not my focus. But the archives is definitely a great place, and that is something that you would like to explore.
Is there any have you come across any documentation of women slaves participating in junkanoo in its earliest forms?
No, I haven't, because like I said, that isn't something that I really focused on with reference to it. Again, that is something that can be explored.
Good evening. Thank you for your presentation.